If I were to ask you, what is the most important predictor of a company's performance? Some of you might guess it's the role of the CEO. Some of you might think it's having a great product or the lowest cost method of producing their product. Um, these are all good guesses, but really, it just happens to be the industry that that company is in. What do I mean by that? So imagine if you were buying stock in a company. If you had bought a financial services company or stock in a bank, doesn't matter if it's Bank of America or Goldman Sachs, your return over the last decade would probably be somewhere under 10%. If you had bought a technology company, um, whether that was LinkedIn or Apple, your return would be closer to 23%. There are differences, of course, within companies or companies within an industry, and we'll talk about those next week. But the biggest distinguishing factor between all these different companies you could have invested in really just has to do with the industry that they're in. We've talked about external environmental factors in the pestle model and how those can impact companies. In this video, we're going to talk about how industry level factors and strategic group level factors can impact the firm. So first, what are those industry level factors? Michael Porter came up with 5 forces that impact all firms in an industry. Those are rivalry amongst existing competitors, the threat of new entrants, the bargaining power of buyers, the bargaining power of suppliers, and the threat of substitute products or services. Porter's theory has become wildly popular, even though there isn't much empirical research to back it up. It is used widely by both industry professionals and academics. Here's an example from a research report that's actually paid research. Companies buy these. This one happens to focus on the oil and gas industry, and it's provided by a company called Data Monitor, and it looks at Porter's 5 forces in the oil and gas industry. I'm going to quickly take a deeper dive into 2 aspects of Michael Porter's 5 forces model. I've also assigned you a video interview with Michael Porter, so you'll hear straight from the horse's mouth a more detailed explanation of the entire model, and he walks through an example of the airlines industry at some depth. But I did want to highlight a couple of things about the threat of entry and existing rivalry. So the threat of new entrants is the risk that potential competitors will enter an industry, and that threat can lower industry profit potential because it drives incumbents to lower their prices or to spend more to satisfy existing customers. I'll give the example of Uber that has sparked a number of price wars in markets across the US to keep Lyft and other ride-sharing competitors out of the market. Some industries have natural barriers that decrease the threat of new entrants. We refer to these as entry barriers. A few of them include economies of scale, network effects, switching costs, and capital requirements. And then there's rivalry amongst existing competitors. The intensity with which companies in the same industry jockey for market share and profitability. The intensity of that rivalry is determined by the competitive industry structure, so the number of competitors and the type of products they produce, whether it's commoditized or highly differentiated. Industry growth. A slower growing industry tends to encourage more rivalry. And strategic commitments. If your competitor just built a major factory, they will not be planning on exiting the industry anytime soon, so they will fight harder to keep their turf. And finally, exit barriers. Sometimes leaving an industry actually forces you to incur costs. So there are four kind of industry competitive structures that you should be familiar with from your economics course. The largest or the easiest way to distinguish between them is really just the number of competitors in each industry, ranging from perfect competition, monopolistic competition, oligopoly to monopoly. We will very rarely encounter perfect competition or monopoly in this class. Most things are somewhere on the continuum in the middle. Finally, let's take a look at strategic groups, because although the five forces will impact all players in an industry, they won't impact every player equally. And one way you can kind of explain why some players are impacted more readily than others is by looking at the actual strategy they follow. So a strategic group is a set of companies that pursue a similar strategy in a specific industry. Strategic groups tend to differ from other strategic groups in terms of their technology, product differentiation, their actual product and service offerings, their pricing, market segments, etc. To make this a little more tangible, here's an example of the airline industry. So you have your major carriers in the US, Delta, United Airlines, American Airlines, that offer a large number of routes through a hub and spoke system and tend to have higher prices. Then you have your low cost point to point carriers. They have limited offerings. You may not be able to fly everywhere on Southwest Airlines, for example, but they tend to offer low or no frills, lower fares. So you would say that JetBlue and Southwest Airlines are in the same strategic group. While these two players are also in the same industry, the airline industry, as Delta and United Airlines, because they follow a different strategy, they might be impacted by certain forces a little bit differently than Delta or United Airlines. For example, if the power, oh, I'll cut this part out. So the tools we've talked about in this video aren't perfect. Five forces analysis and strategic group mapping are both static tools, so they provide a snapshot and don't capture changes over time. In some industries, change happens very quickly, so these can become obsolete very quickly. And these models also don't explain why performance differences happen within an industry. We've talked a little bit about how different strategic groups might be impacted by the five forces differently, but still, even within that strategic group, individual firms sometimes do better than their rivals. And we'll focus on that next week when we talk about internal analysis and firm capabilities.